Near the scrubby edge of Ash Mesa, the wind had a voice. It did not howl, it hissed, a dry, abrasive sound like the sea dragging itself over a shore of broken glass. Grit sifted through the roof planks of the single-room ranch house, dusting the floor, the table, and the sleeping man's eyelids. In the center of the room, a single lantern burned, its light a feeble yellow smear against the oppressive dark. Rowan Pike sat slumped in his rocker, boots on. His body, aching from a day spent fighting dust, drifts away from the cistern. He was rocking, though he hadn't meant to. The motion was an echo of the hours he had just spent trying to soothe his daughter. Juniper was not soothed. She lay in the rough-hewn cradle near the hearth, her small body radiating a dry heat that terrified him. Her breaths were shallow, catching in her chest with a tiny, rasping sound that was nearly lost in the storm's roar. She was 6 months old, born in this room, and she was the only thing Rowan Pike had left of his wife. Ada, now, this land, which had already taken Ada in childbirth, seemed determined to claim the child as well. He rose, his joints cracking, and dipped a rag into the water bucket. The water was lukewarm, gritty. He wiped Juniper's forehead. She whimpered, a sound too weak to be a proper cry, and turned her head away. He was a man who knew how to set a fence post, how to read a skyline for rain, how to break a horse. He did not know how to break a fever. It was then, as the mantel clock ticked over to midnight, that the sound came. Knuckles tapped the door. It was not a frantic, wind-blown slapping. It was 3 distinct raps, measured, solid, the sound of someone who had intended to arrive at this specific door. Rowan froze, his heart hammered against his ribs. Nobody came to Ash Mesa, not this deep into the territory, and certainly not in a dust storm at midnight. His first thought was of raiders. His second, worse, was of someone coming to serve papers on the land he barely held. He reached for the Spencer rifle leaning against the hearth, the metal cool and heavy in his grip. He moved to the door, stepping over a saddle he was mending. "Who is it?" he called, his voice rough. The storm seemed to pause, gathering its breath. A woman's voice cut through the hiss. "Looking for work. Just need a corner of the floor until dawn." The voice was low, steady, and held no trace of pleading. It was a statement. Rowan's hand rested on the thick wooden bar. The child in the cradle let out another pathetic mewl. He could not turn away someone who might be dying, but he could not invite danger in. He lifted the bar, holding the rifle ready with his other hand, and pulled the door inward just a crack. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it wide open against the interior wall. The lantern flame guttered wildly, casting an explosion of shadows. A figure stood silhouetted against the churning brown chaos outside. It was a woman, yes, but she stood upright, not bowed against the gale. She wore a man's coat, and the alkali dust caked her from head to boot, making her look like a statue carved from the mesa itself. She did not move. She let him look. "I need work," she said again, louder this time. Rowan lowered the rifle slightly. "This is a ranch, not a charity, and it is midnight." "I see that," the woman said. She stepped forward, deliberately, into the pool of lantern light. She pulled off a ruined hat, letting a knot of dark, grime-matted hair fall free. Her face was gaunt, exhaustion carved into the lines around her mouth, but her eyes were clear. "I need shelter. I will trade for it." She held up her hands. They were not the hands of a lady from back east. They were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding, the palms thickened with calluses that had cracked open. From her belt, Rowan saw, hung a coil of heavy mending twine and a skinning knife. Juniper's cry rose again, this time escalating into a thin, desperate wail. The woman's eyes snapped to the cradle. The disciplined calm in them flickered, replaced by a sharp, assessing focus. "That child is sick." "She has a fever," Rowan said stiffly. The woman, Nora Vale, as he would learn she was called, did not ask permission. She moved past him, but not directly to the child. Her first glance was to the window, scanning the dark fence line. Her second was to the floor by the door, where the wind had scoured the boards. Rowan realized with a jolt that she was reading the ground, checking for hoof marks, gauging the wind's direction. Only when she seemed satisfied with the perimeter did she turn her full attention inside. "Close the door," she said over her shoulder. "You are letting the chill in." She walked to the cradle. She looked at Juniper for a long moment. "May I?" Rowan, still holding the door against the wind, merely nodded. Nora Vale's movements were economical, devoid of any wasted sentiment. She did not coo or shush. She picked Juniper up with a practiced efficiency. She tested the heat on the baby's neck, then glanced at the water bucket, her nose wrinkling at the grit. She used a corner of her own shawl, the only dry cloth available, and began to swaddle the baby. It was not the gentle wrapping Ada had used. It was a firm, secure binding, pinning Juniper's flailing, restless limbs tight to her body. The baby struggled against the confinement for one sharp second, let out a final, furious cry, and then, as if a spring had been uncoiled, went utterly quiet, a soft, hiccuping hush replacing the sobs. The silence in the room was sudden and profound. Rowan stared, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. Nora looked at him, her face impassive in the lantern light. She needed the comfort of the binding. She feels lost. Rowan finally slammed the door shut and dropped the bar back into its heavy iron brackets. The sound was definitive. "You said you were looking for work," Rowan said, his voice quiet. He did not trust this sudden peace. "I am." Nora did not surrender the child. She rocked her gently, her eyes scanning the sparse cabin, the empty shelves, the single sack of flour, the worn-out pump handle resting by the sink. She said little of herself, nothing of where she had come from or why she was walking the high desert in a storm. She did not have to. Her boots, though sturdy, were worn through at the soles, and the hem of her skirt, visible beneath the heavy coat, was scorched black along one edge, the fibers melted and stiff. She had been near a fire, a recent and powerful one. Rowan's suspicion, momentarily eclipsed by the baby's quiet, returned with a cold rush. He did not like mystery, and this woman was nothing but, as if summoned by his unease. A sound penetrated the cabin, clearer now that the door was barred. It was a deep, metallic clang, a single toll from a heavy bell. Rowan's blood chilled. That was the bell from the church at Hallelujah Draw, a good 10 miles east. It never rang at night, and it certainly should not ring only once, sounding so final, in the teeth of a storm. Nora's body went rigid. She had heard it too. Her head lifted, and her gaze met Rowan's across the small room. The disciplined calm he had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a sharp, hunted alertness that mirrored his own. She knew what that bell meant. "The wind plays tricks," she said, but her voice was flat, the statement a lie they both recognized. She carefully placed the sleeping Juniper back in the cradle, tucking the blankets around the swaddling. The baby's breathing was already deeper. "I trade labor for shelter," Nora said again, her voice regaining its strength. She turned to face him fully. "I can boil willow bark. It is better than quinine for a child's stomach. I can mend that pump handle. I see the leather washers are split. And I don't spook easy." Rowan looked from the sleeping child to the strange, capable woman, and then to the barred door. The storm was a known danger. The fever was a known danger. The single bell toll, and the woman who reacted to it, were not, but Juniper was quiet. "The wood bar is warped," Rowan said, gesturing to the door. "It doesn't sit flush in the brackets. The wind catches it." Nora nodded. She went to the wall, grabbed a small wedge of firewood, and braced it between the bar and the iron bracket, hammering it tight with the heel of her hand. The rattling stopped. They stood near the door, the small act of securing the cabin settling something between them. His shoulder. as he turned, brushed her arm. It was wool against damp canvas, but the contact was stark. It was the first time he had shared a task, stood this close to another soul in this room, since he had buried Ada. A spark of wary, fragile alliance lit between them, fragile as the lantern flame. For the rest of the night, they sat. Nora took the three-legged stool by the hearth, refusing the rocker. Rowan sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. Nora proved true to her word. She found a small tin in her coat pocket, producing dried willow bark. She boiled it in the pot, strained it through a piece of cloth, and, using a spoon, patiently fed the cooled, bitter tea to Juniper every hour. The child, roused from sleep, drank it without fussing. Around 4 in the morning, just as the gray light of a false dawn began to dilute the darkness, Nora stood and placed the back of her cracked hand against Juniper's forehead. She held it there for a full minute. Then she did the same to the child's cheek. She looked at Rowan. The heat is gone. She is sweating. Rowan moved to the cradle. He touched his daughter's skin. It was damp, pliant, and blessedly cool. The fever had broken. Gratitude washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He had been so certain he was going to lose her. He looked at this strange woman, this traveler with scorched clothes and secrets, and his throat felt thick. "I am obliged to you, ma'am," he managed, the words stiff. Nora merely nodded, accepting the thanks as plainly as she had offered the work. She moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy shutter. The storm had passed. The wind had died completely, leaving behind an eerie, scrubbed silence. The air smelled of wet creosote and cold stone, and into that silence, from the direction of the dark mesa, came the sharp, yipping chorus of coyotes. They were close. Rowan stood up. He walked to the door, his rifle in his hand. He checked the bar Nora had wedged tight. Then he turned and walked back, laying the Spencer rifle down on the floor right by the door jamb, where it was visible to them both. It was not a threat. It was a statement, a promise. She was safe in this house. For now. Dawn did not arrive. It seeped in, replacing the oppressive, grit-filled blackness with a thin, bruised purple. The air, scoured clean by the storm, carried the sharp, medicinal tang of wet creosote, a smell of survival. Rowan woke with a start, his neck stiff from sleeping in the rocker. The cabin was cold. His first glance was to the cradle. Juniper was asleep, her breathing deep and even, her skin the color of pale milk, not the angry flush of the night before. Relief made him dizzy. His second glance was to the stool by the hearth. It was empty. The rifle he had placed by the jamb was still there, untouched, but Nora Vale was gone. A cold dread seized him, a suspicion that she'd been a fever dream, or worse, a thief who had taken his mule. He grabbed the Spencer, his heart hammering again, and wrenched the door open, ignoring the wedge she had set. He stopped on the threshold. She was 20 yards away, by the windmill, her back to him. She had not fled. She was working. The storm had gouged out the earth around the windmill's footing, threatening its balance. Nora was tamping the wet sand and rock back into place with a broken fence post, her movements methodical, rhythmic. The pump itself let out a tired, metallic wheeze with each gust of morning breeze, and her tamping fell in time with it, a grim percussion. He walked toward her, his boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. She did not turn, though she must have heard him. She kept working, her shoulders set. "The cistern is dry," she said, her voice flat, as if continuing a conversation. "And this well rope is blistered. It will snap before the week is out." She slammed the post down. Thump, wheeze. "Your feed sack in the lean-to is split down the seam. You lost maybe 20% to the wind and the rats, and that mule." She gestured with her chin toward the small corral. where Hob, his gray mule, stood with his head down. He only moves for molasses. You are out of molasses. Rowan stopped a few feet from her. He looked from the windmill to the lean-to to the mule. She had, in the first 10 minutes of daylight, taken a perfect inventory of his failures. She had seen, with unflinching clarity, just how close to the edge he was. "I know my business," he said, the words sharper than he intended. Nora finally turned to look at him. The morning light was unkind, revealing the deep bruises of exhaustion under her eyes. But those eyes were steady. "You know how to survive," she corrected him, not unkindly. "But you have a child. That requires more than surviving. It requires things to not break." She was right. He hated that she was right. He hated this stranger seeing the raw, desperate truth of his life. Since Ada died 6 months ago, birthing Juniper on the very bed inside that cabin, he had been in a state of rolling collapse. He fixed what was urgent and let the rest slide, and now everything was urgent. He had needed help. He had prayed for it. But the help that arrived was a woman with a scorched hem and a past that made her listen to midnight bells. He weighed the risk. The competence she radiated was a balm to his raw nerves. She had saved Juniper. That was a debt that had no price. But the wild, high lonesome did not send help without a cost. As if to punctuate the thought, a faint sound carried on the clean air from the east, a tiny, rhythmic clicking. Click, clack, click, 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 clack. It was the telegraph from Dust Lantern Station, 8 miles distant. Rowan could barely hear it, just a faint irritation on the edge of the silence. Nora's head snapped up. Her entire body went utterly still. Her focus aimed east as if she could see the sound. Her brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in concentration. She was listening, her lips moving almost imperceptibly, translating the cadence. "What is it?" Rowan asked. Her hand, which had been resting on the fence post, clenched. The clicks stopped, replaced by the rising whistle of the wind. "Just the wire," she said, her voice carefully neutral. She turned back to the windmill footing. "This needs to be packed harder." She understood its cadence. She could read the wire. That was not the skill of a farmhand. They worked. They did not talk. The shared labor was a language all its own. They triaged the chores, moving with a grim efficiency. Nora was the one who set the pace. She went for the well rope first, insisting, "Water first, always." They hauled it up, hand over hand. It was, as she had said, blistered and frayed. Rowan had known, and had put it off. Nora produced the coil of mending twine from her coat and set about splicing the weak sections. Rowan watched her hands. They were, as he had noted, cracked and rough, but they were also deft. She did not tie a simple granny knot. She wove the twine into the rope fibers, her fingers pulling, looping, and tightening with a speed that was mesmerizing. She finished the splice by knotting her kerchief around it, pulling the knot tight with her teeth and a sharp yank of her wrist. It was a locking knot, the kind barge workers used on the big rivers, the kind that held tonnage against a current. It was not the knot of a parlor maid. She saw him watching. "My father worked the docks," she said, offering the small, hard stone of information. She offered nothing else. By midday, the rope was mended, the pump handle's leather washers replaced, and the split feed sack stitched shut with the same river dock twine. Nora refused to stop, refused to eat the jerky Rowan offered. She asked only for paper. "Wages," he said, holding out $2 silver. It was more than he could spare. But the debt for Juniper's life burned in his pocket. "No," she said, not even looking at the coins. "I need paper. A pencil. You have a ledger." He pointed inside to the small, warped desk where he kept his meager accounts. She retrieved the book and a pencil stub, found a flat stump near the wood pile, and sat. She opened the book. Rowan saw the pages, his own clumsy scrawl tracking bushels and cents. Nora turned to a fresh page. And in the shifting, windy light, she began to write. Her figures were perfect. Each number was drawn with an architect's precision, the columns straight as a rifle barrel, the descriptions clear and concise. She was tallying his feed, his remaining supplies, projecting his burn rate. She was, he realized, creating a budget. Rowan felt a strange tightness in his chest. He turned away and went to check on Juniper, who was fussing in her cradle. He picked her up. She was warm and alert, her eyes bright. Nora looked up from the ledger. She saw the child in his arms, and her face softened, the hard, assessing lines dissolving. She held out one finger. Juniper, her own tiny hand waving, latched onto it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Nora's finger, chapped and stained with rope tar and axle grease, was held fast by the perfect, pale innocence of the child. A sharp, familiar ache twisted in Rowan's gut. It was the ache of seeing a tenderness he thought had been buried with Ada. Ada, who had loved to hold the baby, whose hands had been soft. He had forgotten what it looked like. A woman's touch in his home. He swallowed, the ache turning to something else, something he refused to name, and looked away. It was then, at high noon, that he saw the rider. A black silhouette on the high northern ridge. Just a man on a horse, motionless, watching the ranch. The sun was directly behind him, making him a void against the bright blue sky. "Get inside," Rowan said, his voice low. Nora did not ask why. She scooped up the ledger, her eyes scanning the ridges. She saw the rider. She was inside and had the door barred before Rowan had even finished turning. He moved to the window, rifle in hand, peering through the crack in the shutter. The rider just sat there. 1 minute, 2, then, as if satisfied, he wheeled his horse around and vanished back over the crest. Rowan waited. His breath held. Nothing. He went back outside, his boots loud in the sudden silence. He walked, then trotted, then ran toward the wash that cut between his ranch and the ridge. The storm should have turned it into a muddy sluice, erasing any track. He was wrong. On the near bank, just before the ground turned to mud, were 2 clean hoof prints. They were sharp-edged, the soil barely disturbed. The rider had come after the rain. He had been close, and his horse was shod with new iron. This was no drifter. He walked back to the cabin, the sun hot on his neck. Nora was standing in the doorway, Juniper on her hip. She had seen him run. She had seen the tracks. He was looking for something, she said. Or someone, Rowan countered. She looked at the sky, not at him. Her eyes traced the dark, bruised bottoms of the clouds massing in the west. "Those clouds are heavy," she said, her voice all business again. "They will drop their water before they cross the mesa. The Sable Fork Flats will catch it all. The grass there will be up by tomorrow." She was reading the cloud shade, reading it like a map of water he could not see. "You should move the cattle there by evening," she said. "They are weak. They need the new grass." Rowan looked at his small herd, 20 head of gaunt longhorns, huddled by the dry trough. He looked at this woman, who had mended his rope, balanced his ledger, quieted his child, and read the coming weather in a single glance. She was right. He thought of the lone rider, of the single midnight bell, of her scorched hem. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that hiring her meant hiring the trouble that followed her. Juniper gurgled, reaching for a lock of Nora's dark hair. "All right," Rowan Pike said, his voice rough. "We will move them." He had, without saying the word, hired her, 20 miles east, in the sun-baked sprawl of Dust Lantern. The air smelled of stale beer and hot metal. Inside the Last Chance saloon, Sheriff Bram Kell leaned his elbows on the warped pine bar, his tin badge the only bright thing about him. The badge was polished. The man was not. "Just asking is all," he said, his voice a low, companionable drawl that fooled no one. He gave the barkeep his smile, a slow spreading of lips that looked like it was pulled by strings, all tar and teeth. A woman, middling height, dark hair, answers to the name of Nora Vale, might call herself a seamstress. The barkeep, a man worn smooth by neutrality, kept wiping a glass. Lot of folks pass through. Sheriff. This one, Kell said. Might be memorable. She has a talent for setting fires. We had a little trouble over at Hallelujah Draw, a church, burned to the studs. At a corner table, nursing a whiskey, a man in a clean broadcloth suit looked up. Clive Yorick was not a man of the desert. He was a man of deeds and timetables. His waistcoat was buttoned, and inside it, folded neatly, was a preliminary railway deed. He murmured, just loud enough for his own 2 men to hear. It is a shame, but progress requires sacrifice. All that land along Pike's Hollow will be civilized soon enough. The water rights will be secured for the public good. His public good was the railroad syndicate. The barkeep's hand paused on the glass. Pike's Hollow, that is Rowan Pike's place. Widower. Got a new baby. Kell's smile widened, showing a gold tooth. A widower with a baby. My, he will surely need neighbors. Good, solid neighbors. He dropped a nickel on the bar. The sound loud in the quiet room. You see that fire-setting seamstress, you send word. Back at Pike's Hollow, the afternoon was heavy and hot. The work of moving the cattle to the Sable Fork Flats had been brutal. Rowan and Nora were back at the ranch house, the air thick with the smell of their own sweat, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of juniper sleeping in her cradle. Rowan was fixing a harness strap, his hands clumsy with fatigue. Nora was at the table, the ledger open, her pencil scratching quietly, bringing order to his chaos. A sound made Rowan look up. Horses, not 1, but 3, ambling up the track to his house. Nora's head lifted. The pencil in her hand snapped, the tip breaking against the paper. Her jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped beneath the skin. Stay inside, Rowan said. He stood, his body automatically moving to block the doorway. Juniper, sensing the sudden tension, let out a small, waking cry. Without thinking, Rowan scooped her from the cradle, settling her onto his shoulder. He stepped fully into the doorway, the baby a warm, breathing weight against his neck. He rocked her, a slow, steady motion. He felt the exposed vulnerability of her small body and hated, with a sudden, searing intensity, that he was using her as a living shield. But he also knew, with the cold instinct of a man protecting his young, that few men would draw on a father holding his child. Sheriff Bram Kell reined in, his 2 deputies fanning out on either side of him. They did not dismount. Kell, Rowan noted, was the same man who had sold Ada's family land out from under them 6 years ago. Afternoon, Pike, Kell called, all neighborly charm. He tipped his hat. Just making the rounds. We smelled smoke on the wind. Thought we would check. Rowan stared at him. The storm had washed the air clean. There was no smoke but the faint trace from his own chimney. Kell's eyes, pale and flat as buttons, slid past Rowan to the woman standing in the shadows of the cabin. And who is this? Kell asked, his voice softening into something oily. This is Nora Vale, Rowan said, his voice flat. She is hired on. Nora Vale, Kell repeated, as if tasting the name. Well, now, that is a coincidence. That is the very name I was just discussing. Seems a church over at Hallelujah Draw burned down 2 nights ago, right after the bell rang, from what I hear. Nora stepped forward, out of the shadow, her face pale but set. I was there. Oh, I know you were. Kell smirked. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded circular, letting it snap open. Says here you were more than just there. Says here a man died in that fire. A traveling deacon. Says here you are a suspect. The deputies shifted, their hands moving closer to their pistol butts. Nora's voice was steady, cutting through the hot, still air. It was not the voice of a woman defending herself. It was the voice of a woman stating a fact. The fire was in the roof when I arrived. The children were in the vestry. I got them out. I went back for the ledger. A ledger? Kells scoffed. You saved a book instead of the good deacon. The deacon was gone before the roof fell, Nora said. Her eyes locked on his. He was dead by the west door. The fire took the roof after I was already out. I cut the bell rope before I left. Sparks were catching the pews, and I did not want the bell ringing and showering the yard with more. Kell's smirk faltered for a half-second. The detail was too specific, too practical, but he recovered, his gaze hardening. That is a good story. I would surely like to hear more of it. And I think I will just take a look around your property. Pike, see if Miss Vale left any other ledgers. He made a move to swing his leg over the saddle. Rowan did not move. Juniper fussed on his shoulder, and he patted her back, his large, rough hand covering her completely. The air was dead quiet. A single fly buzzed, landing on the sweat-stained neck of Kell's horse. Got a paper says you can, Rowan asked. The words hung in the air, simple, unmovable. Kell's hand froze on his saddle horn. His eyes narrowed, the friendly mask dropping away to show the cold anger beneath. He was the law, and this dirt-poor widower was challenging him. He looked at Rowan, at the baby, at the rifle leaning just inside the door, and at Nora, who stood beside Rowan, a solid, unblinking presence. The silence stretched. The wind picked up, rattling a loose piece of tin on the lean-to roof. One of the deputies licked his lips, his gaze shifting nervously. This was not what he had signed on for. From behind them, a fourth horse approached. It was the rider from the ridge, the one with the new shod horse. He did not speak to Kell. He rode directly to the fence post nearest the house, pulled a folded paper from his vest, and pinned it to the wood with a small tack he produced from his pocket. He glanced at Rowan, his expression blank, then turned his horse and rode back to join the sheriff. Kell stared at Rowan for one last, long moment. Then he smiled. That awful, string-pulled smile. You have a good day. Pike, enjoy the company. He wheeled his horse, his deputies following, and they ambled away. Not in a hurry. They had done what they came to do. Rowan waited until they were a quarter-mile off before he moved. He turned, handing the baby to Nora, and walked to the fence post. He pulled the paper free. It was a railway option, a legal document giving Clive Yorick's company the right to purchase a survey strip straight through Pike's Hollow, citing eminent domain for a new spur line. The offer was a paltry $100. At the bottom, a deadline was stamped in stark red ink. He had 2 weeks to accept, or they would begin condemnation. He walked back to the cabin. Nora was standing by the door, her face ashen. She had watched the entire exchange. Her breath held so tight her ribs ached. Now. She let it out in a long, shuddering sigh. Rowan saw it, saw the courage it took for her to stand there, and he saw the toll it had taken. Her hands were shaking. You should have told me. He said it was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. You would not have let me stay, she whispered. Maybe not, he said. Now you will. He handed her the paper. She read it, her eyes tracking the legal language. He does not want the land for the railway, she said, her voice flat. He wants it for the water, the Sable Fork Flats. How do you know? She looked up, her gaze meeting his, and the full, terrible truth came pouring out. Because they do not want me for a fire. They want me because of the ledger I saved, the one I told Kell about. She pointed to the fireplace, to a single loose stone in the hearth she had identified that morning. The real ledger is hidden there. The one I gave the deacon was the old one. What is in it? Stolen donations, Nora said, her voice hard and cold as iron. Donations meant for the church, for the orphanage, funneled, for the last 3 years, into a shell company. A company that has been buying up land, buying up water rights. The ledger shows the dates, the amounts, and the signature of the man who approved the transfers. She tapped the railway option in Rowan's hand. The shell company is called E.M. Drake, and the man who runs it is Clive Yorick. The confession hung in the air, heavy and absolute as the new bank of clouds pressing down on the mesa. The railway option. Rowan's death sentence stamped in red ink lay on the table between them. Yorick, Kell, a burned church, a dead deacon, a stolen ledger. The pieces were no longer scattered. They formed a noose. And then the sky tore open. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a solid wall of gray water that hit the hard-baked earth with a sound like a drum. Thunder, which had been a distant growl, cracked directly overhead, a sharp, splitting sound that vibrated in Rowan's teeth. "The herd!" Rowan shouted over the din, already moving. The small herd, which they had just moved to the flats, would be terrified. They would scatter, break the weak fences, and be lost in the washes that were, at this moment, turning into muddy, raging torrents. Nora did not hesitate. She grabbed a coil of rope, her oilcloth coat, and was out the door a half-second behind him. There was no thought, only motion. The world dissolved into a blinding, horizontal sheet of water. The wind shoved them, tore at their clothes. They were two small, determined figures fighting a primal force. The cattle were a mass of panicked, bawling shadows, already circling, looking for a way to run. They moved in a wordless sync born of shared necessity. He took the low side, using his horse to shoulder the lead steer back from the dissolving bank of the arroyo. She, on foot, raced to the north fence, her smaller, faster form a dark shape against the gray, hammering down loose staples as the posts wobbled. A yearling bolted, eyes white with terror. Rowan spurred his horse, but the ground was slick, a treacherous, sucking mud. Before he could cut it off, Nora was there. She did not try to stop it. She ran parallel, angling, shouting in a low, sharp voice, turning the animal's panic back on itself until it veered, scrambling, back into the relative safety of the herd. They worked for an hour, soaked to the bone, muscles burning. They were not a man and a woman. They were a single unit, a desperate bulwark against the chaos. When the last fence post was secured and the herd was huddled, steaming and miserable, but penned, they half ran, half stumbled toward the barn. They fell inside, slamming the heavy door against the wind, plunging them into a warm, hay-scented dimness. The only sound was the roar of the rain on the tin roof, a relentless, deafening drumming that shut out the entire world. They leaned against the wall, chests heaving, lungs aching. Water ran from them in puddles, pooling on the dry, packed earth of the barn floor. Rowan, breathing hard, looked at her. Nora pushed a heavy, soaked strand of dark hair from her face. Her coat was plastered to her, and the cold had raised goose flesh on her arms. She was shivering, her teeth chattering, but her eyes were bright, alive with the adrenaline of the fight. He saw her, not as the suspect Kell had named, but as the partner who had just saved his herd. "You are cold," he said, his voice rough. He moved deeper into the barn, toward a heavy wooden trunk that sat against the wall. He lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and dried lavender rose from it, a scent that struck him in the chest like a physical blow. It was Ada's trunk. His hand paused. He reached in and pulled out a heavy, folded wool blanket, a deep blue with a cream stripe, Ada's favorite. He had not touched it since he had packed it away 6 months ago. He stood there for a long moment, the blanket heavy in his hands. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like a necessity. Nora was shivering. He turned, his movements careful. He walked back to her. He did not just hand it to her, he held it out as a deliberate offering. Nora's eyes lifted from the blanket to his face. She saw the careful pause. She saw the history in his hands. She knew this was not just a blanket. She did not speak, but her gaze held his, acknowledging the weight of it. Then, her chapped fingers gently took the wool from him. Rowan stepped back immediately, retreating. He gave her the space. He turned and busied himself with a harness, his back to her. Though the harness needed no mending, he was granting her the dignity of her cold, her exhaustion, and the privacy to wrap herself in his dead wife's comfort. Respect first. He listened to the sound of the wool unfolding, the soft brush of it as she wrapped it tight around her shoulders. The rain hammered the roof, a wall of sound locking them in. When the storm finally broke, easing its roar to a steady, needle-like patter, they moved back to the cabin. The world smelled washed clean, but the danger of the railway option, of Kell, felt closer than ever. Inside, the light was failing. They cooked together, the small domestic act a strange counterpoint to the day's violence. They moved around each other in the small space, a practiced, easy rhythm. Salt pork, beans, boiled coffee. The silence was no longer wary or sharp. It had become companionable. They sat at the small table, tin cups of black coffee steaming in their hands. Juniper slept peacefully in her cradle, the sound of the softened rain a lullaby. Nora, her shoulders still wrapped in the blue blanket, spoke first, her voice quiet. "I could read the telegraph wire by ear when I was 14, she said, staring into her cup. "My father, he worked the riverboat freighters. I kept the accounts." Rowan listened, sensing the confession was a trade for the trust he had shown her. "It was a good life, for a time," she continued, a small, bitter smile touching her lips. "He taught me numbers, how to spot a weighted scale, how to read a contract. He said numbers do not lie, men do." She took a sip. His boat went legit, until it did not. He got caught between two syndicates fighting for the river. He lost, I learned to run. She looked up, her gaze direct. "That is how I knew Yorick's books were rotten. I recognized the pattern. Men like him, they always use the same tricks. They think no one is smart enough to read their ledgers." Rowan nodded, absorbing this. It explained the precise figures in his own ledger. It explained the steel in her spine. He felt the need to offer his own truth, to match the hard coin she had just laid on the table. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, resting on the worn wood. "For 6 months, he said, his voice low. "I have been afraid. Afraid of the quiet. Afraid I would wake up and she would be sick, like last night, and I would not know what to do. Afraid of this land, eating everything I love." He took a sharp breath, the admission costing him. "I am tired of talking to fence posts. I am tired of talking to ghosts." The honesty sat between them, as warm and real as the stove's heat. He had admitted his fear. She had admitted her past. They were, for the first time, equals. The moment was broken by a sudden, sharp wail from the cradle. Juniper was awake, and she was hungry. Before Rowan could move, Nora was on her feet. The blanket slipped, but she ignored it, her focus entirely on the child. "Let me," she said. She lifted Juniper, her movements practiced, maternal. She settled into the rocker, her body naturally adjusting to the small, wriggling weight. Rowan moved to the stove, preparing the small pan of tinned milk, his movements clumsy by comparison. He brought the warmed milk over, standing beside the rocker as Nora held the baby. Juniper fussed, turning her head. Her tiny fists balled up. "Her back," Nora murmured, her head bent. "She likes the pressure. It calms her." Rowan reached out, his large, work-rough hand hovering. He placed it gently on Juniper's back, intending to pat her. Nora's hand was already there, supporting the child's spine. His hand covered hers, his calloused palm against the back of her softer, chapped skin. The warmth of the child, the warmth of her hand, the warmth of his, all met in one single point of contact. It was not a touch, It was a current, a jolt of heat, sharp and sudden as a struck match. They both froze. Their eyes met, wide, over the top of the baby's head. The air in the cabin crackled, suddenly thick. It was the first human touch of comfort, of simple proximity, that either of them had felt in so long. Rowan pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "Sorry," he stammered. "Do not be," Nora whispered, her voice unsteady. Juniper, soothed by the milk and the sudden, intense stillness of the two adults, began to drink, her small mouth working rhythmically. When the baby finally slept, Nora rose and placed her gently back in the cradle. She tucked the blanket around her. She stood, and Rowan, who had been standing by the hearth, had not moved. They were standing too close, by accident. The space between the cradle and the hearth was small. They were barely a foot apart, their shoulders almost touching, both watching the child breathe. Neither of them moved. The silence, filled only by the soft, dripping rain, shifted. The proximity was no longer an accident. It was a choice. It was on purpose. Rowan's heart hammered against his ribs. A slow, heavy beat. He could smell the rain on her, the faint scent of the wool blanket, and the clean, human scent of her skin. He was terrified to move. Nora, her gaze still on the cradle, slowly lifted one hand. Her fingertips, rough from mending his rope, did not reach for his face or his hand. They found the heavy canvas seam of his shirt sleeve. She traced it, from his shoulder down to his elbow. A light, questioning touch. It was not a caress. It was a test. She was testing permission, testing the fragile ice that had formed between them. His breath, which he had been holding, shuddered out of him. He moved. Slowly, he lifted his hand, the one that had covered hers on the baby's back. He did not grab her. He did not pull her close, with a gentleness that seemed foreign to his work-rough hands. He cupped her jaw. His thumb rested on the high, sharp line of her cheekbone. Her skin was so soft against his calluses. She did not flinch. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, her eyes closing for a brief second. He leaned in. The kiss was quiet at first. It was uncertain, a simple pressing of his lips to hers. It was a question. Her hand moved from his sleeve, sliding up to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, holding him. It was the answer. The kiss deepened. It was not the frantic, desperate kiss of hunger. It was a kiss of recognition. His shoulders, which had been knotted with tension for 6 months, finally relaxed. Her breathing, which had been shallow and quick, synced with his, slowing, deepening. It was a promise. It was two solitudes meeting in the dark. They stopped before haste could cheapen it, before the pure, aching need could overwhelm the meaning. Rowan pulled back, but only an inch, resting his forehead against hers. They stood like that, breathing the same air. A small, shaky smile touched Nora's lips. He felt it more than saw it. He found himself smiling back. A strange, rusty feeling. It was like they had both just remembered a word they desperately needed, a word they thought they had forgotten forever. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine, quiet mist. The world was holding its breath, and in the small, lamp-lit cabin, under the steady sound of the dripping eaves, the world approved. The kiss had not solved their problems. It had given them a reason to face them. The dawn that followed the rain was sharp and cold, the sky a bruised, clean blue. The railway option lay on the table, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. It was a declaration of war. Nora, wrapped in Ada's blue blanket, was already at the table when Rowan emerged from his room. Juniper settled on his hip. Nora was not looking at the railway option. She was looking at the blank ledger page she had started the day before. Her pencil, the one she had snapped, was gone. In its place was Rowan's straight razor, with which she had meticulously sharpened a new point. She began to write. Rowan stood, silent, watching her. It was not the casual accounting of a hired hand. This was the work of an auditor, a cartographer of theft. Her hand did not pause. She drafted from memory a clean, precise accounting of the Hallelujah Draw church ledger. She created columns, dates, amounts, donor names. She marked which entries had been made in black ink, which in the faded brown of the older pastor, and then she made the final column notes. Beside 3 large anonymous donations, she wrote routed via dust lantern, signed E.M. Drake. Beside a 4th, larger sum, she wrote funds transferred from orphanage account, ink color blue, steel nib, signature Lyman Orta. Lyman Orta, Rowan said, reading the name. The deacon, Nora said, not looking up. The one Kell said died in the fire. He was the money man. He handled the books before I was asked to look at them. She finished the page, a perfect, damning mirror of the one she had hidden. Then she took another sheet of paper. She sketched a rough map, a dot for his ranch, Ash Mesa, a line east to Dust Lantern Station, a final X for Hallelujah Draw. I need the real ledger, she said, her voice quiet but absolute. And the bell rope I cut. The rope proves I was there to stop the fire, not start it. The ledger proves why they started it. Rowan's entire body tensed. His instinct was to barricade, to defend the ground he stood on. We have your copy. We have the child. We stay. We fortify. I will not risk Juniper on the road. Nora finally looked up, her gaze meeting his, and there was no softness in it, only a terrible, clear-eyed logic. Rowan, they are not coming for the land first. They are coming for me. As long as I am here, this ranch is the target. That rider yesterday. Kell's visit, they were not warnings. They were range-finding. She stood, placing her hand on the railway option. This is the polite request. The fire is the answer if you refuse. They will not stop at the fence line. They will burn this cabin, and they will not care that Juniper is inside. Staying here does not shield her. It puts her in the center of the bullseye. He looked at his daughter, her small, perfect hand clutching his shirt. Nora was right. His fortress was a tinderbox. If we run, he said, the words tasting like ash. We are not running, Nora corrected him, her voice fierce. We are hunting. We get the evidence. We get it to a judge. We cut the head off the snake before it has a chance to strike. The decision was made. The sun, which had been climbing, began its long, slow descent. They rode at dusk. Rowan carried Juniper. He had fashioned a sling from a soft feed sack, settling her against his chest, her warmth a fragile, terrifying counterweight to the rifle slung on his back. Nora rode Hob, the mule, her face set, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon. They did not speak, saving the horse's strength, moving through the purple twilight as shadows themselves. They reached Dust Lantern Station near 10 o'clock. It was not a town, just a wooden shed and a water tower, a single, greasy yellow light shining from the telegraphist's window. Rowan stayed with the horses and the sleeping baby, hidden in a dry wash 50 yards back. Nora slid from the mule and walked toward the light, her boots silent in the dust. She did not knock. She moved to the side of the building, to the window, staying out of the spill of the lantern. She tapped on the glass, a sharp, rhythmic clicking. Click, clack, click, 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 clack. The telegraph key inside, which had been silent, suddenly answered. Click, clack, 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 click. A question. Nora tapped again. Faster this time. Her code, her name from the river. The key inside paused. Then, a new burst of clicks. Slower, more deliberate. The telegraphist was tapping out the day's wire traffic. He was reading from his log. Nora stood, frozen, translating. Rowan watched her, a rigid silhouette against the light, her hand, which had been at her side, clenched into a fist. She listened for a full 5 minutes. When the key went silent, She tapped twice on the glass, a sound of thanks, and melted back into the darkness. She slid onto the mule, her face grim. "He owes me, from the riverboat days in Natchez. He hid me when my father's partners came looking." "What did it say?" Rowan asked. "Kel, he wired the U as Marshal in Prescott. He has officially named me for the murder of Deacon Orte. He is claiming I set the fire to cover my tracks. He has requested a hanging judge be sent. He wants a rope around my neck before Sunday." Sunday. They had 3 days. And Orte. The telegraphist says Orte was not supposed to be there. He was supposed to be on a train to St. Louis. Yorick was sending him away. "The money man," Rowan breathed. "He was running." "Which means," Nora said, her voice cold as the night air, "he is not dead. Kel is lying." They rode for Hallelujah Draw. They arrived well after midnight. The church was a skeleton against the stars. The moon, a thin, curved sliver, offered almost no light. All that remained were the stone foundations and the 4 charred, skeletal posts of the bell tower. The air was thick with the smell of wet char, pine pitch, and something else. Something metallic. Fear. Rowan handed Juniper to Nora, the baby stirring and whimpering in the cold. "Stay here, in the shadow of this rock." "No," Nora said. "If they find you, they find me. We do this together." She held the baby tight, and Rowan lit their one lantern, the light seeming obscenely bright in the graveyard stillness. "The steps," Nora whispered, moving toward the front of the ruin. "The vestry steps. I hid it under the 3rd riser." The steps were a pile of blackened, half-burned timbers. Rowan gave Nora the lantern and took the rifle, scanning the darkness, every nerve ending screaming. The silence was too deep. Nora knelt, placing the lantern on the ground. She did not need to pry. The wood was brittle. She dug at the char and the damp earth with her bare hands, her breath coming in short, sharp hisses. "It is here," she whispered. Her hand closed around a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. She pulled it free. It was the ledger. Tucked beside it was a small, tin box. She opened it. It was full of script stubs, the kind companies paid their workers in. Each one was stamped with the unmistakable brand of Clive Yorick's cattle syndicate. "The proof," she said, her voice shaking with triumph. A scuff of leather on stone. Rowan turned, rifle already at his shoulder. The lantern light caught movement by the ruined altar. A man in a dark suit, his clerical collar stark white. He was not a ghost. Deacon Lyman Orte. Orte, his face gaunt with terror, sprinted for the darkness of the cemetery. "Watch the baby!" Rowan yelled. He did not shoot. This man was the key. He ran, tackling the deacon in the tall, dead grass. The sound a heavy, grunt-filled thud. Orte did not fight. He was a man of numbers, not violence. He sobbed, sprawling in the dirt. Rowan hauled him up by the collar. "He said you were dead," Rowan growled, his face inches from the deacon's. "He was supposed to," Orte hissed, his voice thin and reedy. "I was supposed to be gone, but I came back. I came back for the emergency funds. He lied to me. He said it was just a land deal, not murder." "Who lied to you?" "Yorick. He sent Kel to set the fire, to burn the books. He knew I would be blamed." From the darkness, a voice. "You talk too much. Deacon." The flat, dead sound of a rifle shot snapped through the night. Deacon Orte was slammed backward, out of Rowan's grip, a dark stain blossoming on his white collar. He fell and did not move. "Nora, the light!" Rowan roared, diving for the ground. A second shot. The lantern exploded, showering the clearing in shattered glass and hot oil, plunging them into absolute, blinding darkness. Juniper screamed, the sound a thin, terrified wail in the sudden black. "Rowan!" Nora's voice, tight with panic, from 10 feet away. I am here. Crawl. Crawl toward the arroyo. Now. Another shot. A bullet chewed the adobe wall where Nora had been standing, spraying them with grit. They were being bracketed. I cannot see, Rowan yelled, his eyes useless. You do not need to, Nora's voice came, suddenly calm, right by his ear. She had moved like a shadow. Give me your hand. He found her hand. It was steady. Follow me. Smell the creosote. It is stronger to the left. That is the wash. Keep the wind on your right cheek. She pulled him. They scrambled, half crawling, half running. Juniper's wails muffled against Nora's coat. A bullet whined past Rowan's head. So close he felt the heat of it. They slid, tumbling down a loose shale bank, into the cold, damp mud of the arroyo. They ran, crouching low, water splashing their legs. The rifle fired again, but the shots were wild now, the shooter firing blind into the darkness. The darkness was their ally. They ran until their lungs burned and the sounds of pursuit faded. Nora found it, a deep cut in the canyon wall, a fissure in the basalt rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. They holed up inside, a small, cold alcove hidden behind a curtain of rock. They were trapped. They were soaked. They were alive. Rowan leaned against the cold stone, his rifle across his knees, listening. The only sounds were the drip of water, Juniper's muffled, exhausted sobs, and their own breath, steaming in the cool night air. His pulse was a heavy, panicked drumming, so loud it felt like it could be heard for miles. It sounded like distant, approaching hooves. In the basalt alcove, the darkness was a physical weight. The echo of the last gunshot seemed to be imprinted on the stone, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the arroyo and Juniper's whimpering, which had finally softened into the exhausted, hiccuping breaths of sleep. Rowan sat nearest the fissure's opening, his back pressed against the cold rock, the Spencer rifle heavy across his knees. He was listening, his entire body a taut wire of adrenaline. He had seen Deacon Orte fall. He had heard the bullet whine past his own head. He tried to check the rifle's chamber, but his hands were trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that made the metal rattle. It was not the cold. It was the sickening aftermath of the kill, the visceral shock of being hunted. Nora, having settled Juniper into a dry hollow between two stones, insulating her with the baby's own blanket, heard the sound. She reached out in the absolute blackness, her hand finding his. His were shaking so hard he could barely grip the rifle. Her hand, steady and warm, closed over his. She did not speak. She simply held them, her own calluses pressing against his shaking knuckles, her strength a silent anchor in the dark. She held them until the tremors began to subside, until his breathing, which had been ragged, started to slow. She leaned closer. The space was so small they were already sharing the same air, scented with damp stone, gunpowder, and fear. She lifted his hand, the one her own was covering, and brought his knuckles to her lips. It was a gesture of profound, aching gratitude, a kiss that said, "We are alive." It was a thank you for the running, for the shared danger, for not leaving her at the church. It was desire folded so tightly into gratitude they were indistinguishable. Then she released his hand, and her fingers, which had been so steady, found the rough stubble of his jaw. She kissed his mouth. It was a soft, hesitant question in the dark. Rowan answered it, all the fear, the adrenaline, the cold fury at Kell, and the terrible loneliness of the last 6 months dissolved into that single point of contact. He turned, his body aching, and his arm came around her waist, pulling her flush against him. His mouth answered hers, and the kiss, which had been gentle, became a downpour. It was the answer to the night, a confirmation that they were not ghosts, that the bullets had missed. It was a drowning, a saving. Nora's other hand slid from his jaw to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, holding him fast. It was a yes. It was stay. Their heavy, damp coats were a cold barrier between them, stiff with mud and wet wool. They shrugged them off, the wet canvas sliding to the ground, pooling at their hips. The night air was sharp, biting at their skin, but the heat radiating between them was immediate, a furnace against the cold stone. A sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped Rowan's throat. It was the sound of a spring uncoiling. Nora pulled back, just an inch. He could not see her, but he felt her smile against his lips. "This is a hell of a place to do this," she whispered, her voice shaky with relief. The quiet, desperate laughter faded, replaced by a profound, shared focus. There was only their breathing, sinking in the small, dark space. His hands, no longer trembling, moved from her waist. They found the simple, damp cotton of her shirt. He did not fumble. His touch was slow, deliberate. His palms moved up, mapping the long, strong line of her spine through the thin fabric. He felt the tension there, the knots of her long run, and his touch was a silent promise to unmake them. She anchored herself to him, her hands gripping the hard muscles of his shoulders, her forehead pressing against his. He felt her breath catch as his hands spanned her back, claiming, comforting. "Rowan," she whispered. His name was not a plea, but an affirmation, a statement of fact. "Nora," he murmured back, his voice thick. His hand moved from her back, sliding up the column of her neck, his thumb finding the delicate shell of her ear. He cupped her face, his calluses rough against her skin, and kissed her again. It was slower this time, a relearning, a mapping of lips, a sharing of breath. Her hands released his shoulders and moved to his wrists, holding him there, her fingers tracing the veins on his skin. It was not a kiss of frantic hunger, but of profound, necessary closeness. It was the promise made on the porch, now sealed in darkness and danger. A faint skitter of rock echoed from the arroyo outside. They both froze, instantly. In a fraction of a second, the intimacy evaporated, replaced by the sharp, metallic alertness of the hunted. Rowan's hand was back on his rifle, Nora's head tilted, her body utterly still, listening. They were a lookout post again, 2 soldiers in a foxhole. Silence. They waited, their breathing held. 1 minute, 2. The sound did not come again. It was the wind, or a night animal settling. Rowan let his breath out in a slow, controlled sigh. He turned his head. In the faint starlight that now filtered into the cut, he could just make out the pale oval of her face. Inches from his, he saw her grin, a flash of white teeth. The absurdity of it, the madness of sharing a heartbeat and a lookout post, struck them both. "You kiss like a man who grew up with long winters," she teased, her whisper so low it was barely audible. "Slow to start. Then you mean to bury the world." A rusty smile touched Rowan's own lips. He leaned his forehead against hers, his voice a low murmur against her skin. "And you love like someone who survived them, like you know it is the only thing that thaws the ice." The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind a bone-deep chill and an exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. They needed to rest. They had to be moving by dawn. Rowan retrieved the heavy wool blanket from where Nora had dropped it. It was damp, but it was all they had. He settled against the back wall, his legs stretched out, the rifle resting in his lap, facing the entrance. Nora, after checking Juniper one last time, slid down beside him. She tucked herself against his side, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. He wrapped the single blanket around both of them, a shared, meager shelter. The cold moon-cool air touched their bare shoulders, a reminder of their exposure, of the thinness of the barrier between them and the men hunting them. They did not sleep, not yet. They watched the narrow slice of sky visible from the alcove. Clouds, thin as smoke, drifted like cattle across the field of stars. "When this is done," Nora said, her voice muffled against his shirt, "I am not running anymore." She sounded surprised by the words herself. "I am so tired of knowing how to read the wind. I just want to stop. I want to build a fence that holds." Rowan tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. He thought of the railway option, of Kell's tar smile, of the burned church. He looked at the sliver of sky. "We will have a home," he promised, the words an oath spoken to the stone and the stars. "We will have a home, and it will not burn just because a rich man wills it." As if in answer, the wind, which had been still, turned. It whistled low at the mouth of the alcove, and from far off, from the mesas they had crossed, came the clear, sharp yips of coyotes, answering the oath with a faraway, wild chorus. They finally slept. A fitful, shared sleep, heads tilted together, the rifle heavy across their laps. Dawn came not as a light, but as a slow, painful edging of pale silver against the black basalt. The darkness in the alcove diluted to gray, revealing the exhaustion etched on their faces. Rowan woke first, his neck stiff, the cold having settled deep in his bones. He looked at Nora, her face peaceful in sleep, the lines of fear and flight erased. He looked at his daughter, a small, breathing mound, safe between the stones. The cold, the fear, and the impossible intimacy had forged something new in the crucible of the night. He was no longer just a widower. She was no longer just a refugee. They were, in the cold gray light, inextricably, fiercely, more us than they were two. They rode back from Hallelujah Draw not as two survivors, but as a single, cold-burning fuse. They possessed the oilcloth-wrapped ledger, the tin of script stubs, and the fresh, horrific memory of Deacon Ortiz' murder. They had 2 days until Sunday, the day Kell's noose was meant to tighten. They reached Pike's Hollow as the sun, a weak, watery eye, cleared the eastern mesa. The ranch was silent, just as they had left it. But it was no longer a home. It was a fortress. It was a trap. "They know we went for the ledger," Rowan said, his voice a low scrape. He slid from his horse, his body aching, and lifted Juniper from the sling. "They saw the bodies. They will not wait for the marshal." "They will come here," Nora said, her voice flat. "All business." She took the baby, who was blessedly asleep. "They have to silence us. They have to get that ledger." They did not rest. They fortified. First, the herd. They moved the 20 head of cattle from the exposed flats into the narrow box draw west of the cabin. It had sheer rock walls and only one entrance. Rowan threaded 3 small bells onto a leather thong and tied it around the lead cow's neck. "If they try to rustle them, we will hear it. It is the only warning we will get." Second, weapons. Rowan checked his Spencer rifle, the action smooth and oiled. He handed Nora the older, heavier sharps. "It shoots true at 500 yards, he said, "but it is slow to load." "I do not need to be fast," Nora replied, her voice grim as she tested the weapon's weight. "I just need to be accurate." Rowan took the sharps back, wrapped it in a piece of dry canvas, and moved to the woodpile. He buried it there, under a concealing layer of split logs, sighting it on the main track that led to the house. It was a hidden defense, a last resort. Third, deception. Rowan took Hob, the mule, and rode him a half-mile downhill toward the main road. He cut back through the rocky scrub, his path careful, leaving a clear set of decoy tracks pointing away from the ranch. Let them think they had fled. Finally, water. They worked in tandem, the silence between them filled only by the rhythmic, metallic shing-clank of the pump handle. They filled every bucket, every trough, every empty barrel. They soaked 3 heavy canvas tarps until they were too heavy to lift, leaving them in a heap by the cabin wall. They were preparing for a siege. They were preparing for fire. They did not have to wait long. The sound came just before noon, carried on the hot, dry wind. It was the steady, confident beat of hooves. Not one rider, or even three. This was a posse. At least 10 men. Rowan stood in the doorway. The Spencer held loose in his hands. Nora was just behind him, in the shadows, holding Juniper. The baby was awake now, fussy, sensing the oppressive tension that had settled over the hollow. Sheriff Bram Kell rode at the head, his tin badge glinting, his tar smile firmly in place. Beside him, looking pale and sick in the bright daylight, was a man in a city suit. It was the man Nora had named from the ledger, E.M. Drake, Yorick's accountant. Behind them, a posse of hard-faced men fanned out in a half-circle, rifles resting on their saddle horns. They were cowhands and hired guns, men Rowan recognized from the Dust Lantern Saloon, men who worked for wages and asked few questions. Kell reined in 20 yards from the cabin, close enough for his voice to carry easily. "Afternoon, Pike. You have had a busy night. We found your man, the deacon. A terrible thing. Murdered, just like we thought." "He was your man, Kell," Rowan said, his voice flat and cold. "Not mine." "Now, that is just slander," Kell said, feigning hurt. "But we are not here about that. We are here." He gestured with his chin toward the pale accountant. "On a matter of theft." Drake, his hands visibly shaking where they gripped the saddle horn, pointed a trembling finger. He did not point at Nora. He pointed at the ground, toward the small, mounded door of the root cellar. "There," Drake stammered, his voice reedy. "In the root cellar. That is where she told the deacon she would hide the stolen church funds, the money she took." Rowan and Nora exchanged a single, cold glance. It was a lie. A prepared, practiced lie. They were not here on a charge of murder, which was complicated. They were here on a charge of theft. It was a cleaner charge, a way to legally justify what was about to happen. "I have a writ," Kell announced, pulling a paper from his vest. "Signed by the circuit judge. It gives me the right to search this property, top to bottom, for the stolen church property." "That paper is a lie and you know it," Rowan said. "It is the law. Pike, step aside." Kell's hand dropped, his thumb hooking over his pistol butt. The posse behind him shifted, their rifles lifting, the muzzles all centering on the dark doorway. The siege had begun. The sound of 10 rifles being cocked was a dry, terrible clicking in the midday silence. Rowan braced himself, his muscles tensing, ready to drop and fire. And then Nora stepped out. She moved from the shadows of the cabin to stand beside Rowan in the harsh, revealing sunlight. She was holding Juniper. She did not hold the child like a shield, not in the way he had done the day before. She held her close, her hands splayed protectively over the baby's back, her face a mask of cold, maternal fury. She stood in the open, defiant, a mother protecting her home, her eyes sweeping across the line of men. The posse flinched. It was a small, collective movement, but it was unmistakable. Their rifles, which had been aimed at Rowan's chest, wavered. The men looked at each other, their expressions souring. They were hired guns, perhaps, but they were also fathers, brothers, sons. They had signed on to back the law, maybe to bust a head or run a squatter off. They had not signed on for this, not for pointing a line of loaded rifles past a 6-month-old child. It was the line, the moral line drawn in the gun smoke, and Kell was asking them to cross it. Kell saw their hesitation, his face, which had been a mask of legal authority, twisted into a vicious sneer. He was losing control. "Damn you, Pike!" he spat, his voice thick with frustration. "Hiding behind a woman, hiding behind a baby." "I am not hiding," Rowan said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense air. "I am standing on my land." "Land," Kell laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. This is not your land. This is railroad land. He looked back at his wavering posse, his voice rising to a shout. He is a squatter, and she, he pointed a rigid finger at Nora, is a murderer and a thief. We are here for the ledger that proves it. Then go get it, Nora challenged, her voice ringing clear, cutting through his... Kel's eyes narrowed to slits. He was trapped. He could not order his men to fire on a woman holding a baby. He could not retreat, not with Drake there to report back to Yorick. Fine, he hissed, his face dark. Fine. If you will not come out, we will smoke you out. He turned to his deputies. Milo, Gant, get the coal oil from the saddlebags. Burn the barn. If they like fire so much, give them a taste of it. This was the new line. Arson. One of the cowhands, a young man named Milo Gant, paled beneath his sunburn. Sheriff, he stammered, his horse shifting nervously. The writ says search. It does not say arson. You do as you are told, Gant, Kel roared, or you will be charged as an accomplice to murder yourself. Gant looked at the baby in Nora's arms. He looked at the writ in Kel's hand. He looked at Kel's furious, desperate face. Slowly, deliberately. Milo Gant lowered his rifle. He did not dismount, but he rested the barrel on his saddle horn, his hand moving away from the trigger. I signed on for wages. Sheriff, he said, his voice quiet but carrying. Not for burning. The standoff wobbled. Doubt, thick as smoke, was spreading. A deputy, more loyal or perhaps just more afraid of Kel, scrambled from his horse with a can of oil. He ran to the barn, splashing it on the dry, seasoned wood of the lean-to. A match was struck, a whoosh, and the side of the barn went up like a torch. Now the house, Kel ordered, his voice triumphant. Rowan did not wait. Nora, the tarps! He did not have to explain. He slammed the Spencer rifle into her hands. Shoot at the sky if they rush, he commanded. He turned and sprinted, not for cover, but for the pump. He grabbed the handle and threw his entire weight into it, his muscles screaming in protest. The pump wheezed, coughed, and then gushed clear. Cold water. Nora, holding Juniper on one hip, the heavy rifle in the other, did not fire. She dragged the soaked, heavy canvas tarps, one-handed, to the side of the house, angling them against the eaves just as the deputy tossed his torch. The first tongue of flame licked at the cabin wall. Rowan pumped. The rhythmic thud, clank was a desperate heartbeat. Water spilled from the full trough, overflowed, and hit the superheated cabin wall where the flames had just begun to bite. It did not douse the fire. It created a bomb of steam. A massive rolling cloud of white fog and steam snarled across the yard, instantly obscuring the house, the posse, and the burning barn. It was a scalding, blinding curtain. What in? One of the men yelled, his horse rearing in panic. It is just steam, Kel shouted, his voice muffled and angry. Hold the line. Wait for it to clear. But there was no line to hold. Under the cover of the steam, Nora moved. She handed the baby and the rifle to Rowan, who knelt in the mud and the mist, a phantom guardian. Keep pumping, she whispered, her voice fierce. She slipped, low and fast, away from the house. Not toward the barn, toward the fence line, where Yorick's survey stakes were planted. She moved like a shadow in the fog. She found the fresh pine stakes, the ones with the red ink. With quick, savage movements, she yanked them from the soft, wet earth. She moved 20 feet to the east, deeper into her own property, farther from the wash, and slammed them back into the ground. It was a small, desperate shift, but a significant one. She had just shifted Yorick's lawful claim. It would not stop them today, but it would muddy the water in a courtroom. It would buy them time. She slipped back to Rowan just as the steam began to thin, the fire on the cabin wall sputtering, the wood blackened and smoking but not truly caught. The posse was visible again, their horses skittish, their faces streaked with soot and confusion. The barn, however, was now fully engulfed, a tower of roaring orange flame. Rowan stopped pumping. He stood up, juniper secure on his chest, the Spencer rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not aim it. He spoke, his voice not a shout, but a clear, carrying statement. He was not talking to Kell. He was talking to Milo Gant and the other wavering men. "You men," he called out. "You know this land. You know what it is worth. You are working for wages."
"Get on with it, Pike,"
Kell snarled, pulling his revolver. Rowan ignored him. "You are working to help a syndicate man steal the water from this hollow. When he owns this," he gestured to his smoking wall, "he owns the Sable Fork, and when he owns that, he sets the price for every head of cattle you ever hope to run." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You are not earning wages. You are working to make your own Wells Company property." Heads tilted. The men looked at each other. They knew the truth of it. They lived the truth of it, every dry season. This was not about a ledger. This was about water. This was about their own future. Doubt spread faster than the flame. Kell saw it. He saw his authority, his posse, his entire plan dissolving in a cloud of steam and doubt. He lost his last shred of control. He raised his revolver, his face purple, and fired wild. A shot of pure, blind rage. The bullet snapped past Rowan's head, thudding into the cabin door. Rowan did not flinch. He did not fire back. He slowly, deliberately, raised the Spencer to his shoulder. He did not aim for Kell's chest. He aimed 2 inches higher. He fired. The shot was a single, deafening crack. It was not a shot of rage. It was a shot of punctuation. Bram Kell's hat, the symbol of his authority, flew from his head. It spun in the air, a perfect, round hole split cleanly through the brim, and landed in the mud. Kell froze, his hand still extended, the pistol smoking. His eyes were wide with shock. He slowly reached up, his fingers touching his sweat-soaked hair, feeling the half-inch graze the bullet had left. Silence. Milo Gant spat in the dirt. "That is enough," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "I am not getting killed for Clive Yorick's paperwork." He reined his horse around and trotted away. Another man followed. "He is right. This ain't our fight." "Get back here," Kell screamed, his voice cracking. "You are deputies of the law." "No," another man called over his shoulder. "We are just hired. And we are fired." The posse peeled away in 2s and 3s, dissolving like mist, unwilling to die for another man's ledger. In less than a minute, it was over. Only Kell, his 2 loyal deputies, and the accountant, Drake, remained. Drake looked at the smoking house, at Rowan Pike standing like a stone statue with his child and his rifle, and at Kell, who was trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "This is not over," Drake hissed, his voice reedy, trying to find some purchase of authority. "This is not over. Pike, lawyers will do what bullets did not. The railroad is coming." "Get off my land," Rowan said. They went, Kell hatless and humiliated, rode last, the deputies and the accountant scattering before him. Rowan and Nora stood, side by side, watching them go. The yard was a ruin. The air stank of soot and steam. The barn, their hay, their winter feed, was a pyre, collapsing in on itself in a shower of sparks. But the house still stood. Juniper, who had been shocked into silence by the gunshot, let out a small, complaining cry. The ranch, smoke-scarred, waterlogged, and wounded, was unbowed. Like them, the smoke from the barn fire hung in the air for a full day, a bitter gray pall that reminded them of their losses. The cabin was scarred, the side wall blackened and smelling of char, but it stood. They had won the siege. They had lost the winter. Rowan, his hands raw from dousing the last of the embers, looked at the railway option paper. The deadline was Saturday. Today was Friday. Kell and Yorick had not just failed. They had been humiliated. They would not wait for lawyers. They would come back, and they would come back with a fury that no posse of wavering cowhands could stop. Lawyers will do what bullets did not, Drake had hissed. Nora, packing the oilcloth-wrapped ledger into a saddlebag, looked up. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes red-rimmed from the smoke, but her voice was pure steel. Then we will use the law first. They rode before the sun was an hour high. They left the smoldering barn, the decoy tracks, and the scarred cabin behind. They rode east, not toward Dust Lantern, but south, on the long, hard road to the territorial county seat. They rode with a single, desperate purpose. They were going to see Circuit Judge A. Whit Tolland. They arrived in the late afternoon. Two smoke-stained, exhausted figures on worn-out horses. Rowan carried Juniper, who was wrapped in the last clean blanket they owned. The town was a sprawl of new pine and old adobe, bustling with miners, lawyers, and merchants. Judge Tolland's chambers were not grand. They were a cramped room behind the land office, smelling of dusty books, stale tobacco, and the unyielding iron of the law. Tolland himself was a rail-thin man with a sour expression and a beard stained yellow by nicotine. He was known as a hanging judge, a man who believed in swift, hard justice and had little patience for the nuances of human failing. He looked up from a stack of files as they entered, his eyes dismissing them in a single glance. The court is in recess. Whatever land dispute this is, see the clerk Monday. Sir, this is not a land dispute. It is a murder, Rowan said, his voice rough with fatigue. Murders are for the local sheriff. Tolland snapped, his gaze returning to his papers. The sheriff, Nora said, her voice cutting through the dusty air, led the men who tried to burn us out yesterday, and he is covering up the murder of Deacon Lyman Orty. Tolland's pen stopped. He looked up, his gaze sharpening. He looked at Nora, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the soot, the exhaustion, and the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. You are making a serious accusation, madam, one that could see you jailed for slander. It is not slander, Your Honor, Nora said. She stepped forward and laid her evidence on his desk. She did not present the story. She presented the facts. First, the copies of the church ledger pages, the ones she and Rowan had frantically transcribed in the cold basalt cut. Second, the tin box of script stubs, each one bearing Clive Yorick's brand. Third, her own memory. She recited, from rote, the telegraph log she had heard at Dust Lantern Station. Funds routed through Dust Lantern to M. Drake, wire from Kell to U.S. Marshall, Prescott, requesting writ for Nora Vale, murder, arson, wire from Yorick to Deacon Orte, confirming train passage, St. Louis, 2 days ago. Tolland's sour expression did not change, but his eyes, the eyes of a man who lived by the book, began to glitter with a cold, predatory interest. He picked up the copied ledger pages. He ignored the story of the fire. He looked at the columns. He saw the dates, the amounts, the donor names, and he saw Nora's precise, perfect accounting of the funnel, the theft from the orphanage account, the signature of Lyman Orte. This was not a messy tale of frontier violence. This was theft. This was a neat column of numbers that added up to a crime. Judge Tolland, who had a private, obsessive affection for perfect columns of numbers, was intrigued. Clive Yorick, Tolland murmured, his fingers tracing the name. He leaned back in his chair. He is a man of progress, a railroad man. He filed the deed transfer for the Pikes Hollow water rights this very morning. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 o'clock. The banks close at noon on Saturday. That is tomorrow. He intends to finalize the transfer of funds and seize the deed before the circuit opens on Monday. He is very efficient.
Sir, he tried to kill us,
Rowan said, his voice vibrating with anger. He tried to move you, Mr. Pike. The law sees a difference, Tolland said dryly. He tapped the script stubs. But this is fraud, and fraud offends me. He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen. He began to scribble, his handwriting a sharp, angry slant. I cannot stop a murder that has not happened, but I can, and I will, stop a fraudulent financial transaction. He finished with a flourish, slamming his desk drawer open and pulling out his personal seal. He pressed it into the hot wax he dripped on the page. This is an injunction, a judicial stay. It freezes any and all transfers related to the railway deed filed by Clive Yorick, pending a full investigation into these irregularities. He handed the paper to Rowan. But it is just paper. It is only as good as the man who serves it, and it must be served on the deed itself, before that bank president in dust lantern stamps it paid at noon tomorrow. A knock came at the door. Marshal, Tolland called, not looking up. The door opened, and U.S. Marshal Abel Cutter entered. Cutter was the physical opposite of Bram Kell, where Kell was slovenly and loud. Cutter was immaculate. He was polite as a razor. He wore a clean duster, and his federal star was pinned to a vest, not a shirt. He did not speak. He simply waited. Marshal, Tolland said, you are to ride to Dust Lantern. You will be at the First Territorial Bank when it opens at 9 tomorrow morning. You will serve this injunction on Mr. Yorick's deed. You will use any force necessary to ensure that paper is not validated. Cutter took the document, folded it once, and tucked it into his duster. He looked at Rowan. He looked at Nora. His gaze rested for a long, assessing moment on the sleeping child in Rowan's arms. Yorick will have men. Cutter stated it was not a question. Yes, Rowan said. Cal will be there, Nora added. Cutter nodded, his expression unreadable. He looked back at Rowan. The child, before this erupts, I want her somewhere safe. Not with you. Not at the hotel. Yorick's men will be watching. He was not making a request. A cold fist tightened in Nora's stomach. To have come this far, only to be separated from Juniper. Rowan understood immediately. He knew this town. He nodded. The livery, old Mrs. Lark's. They moved as a unit. Cutter went to the marshal's office. Rowan and Nora went to the livery, a large, sprawling barn that smelled of hay and horse liniment. Old Mrs. Lark's was a woman carved from the same hard granite as the mesas, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and clear. She had been a friend of Ada's. Rowan, she said, her voice rough as a corn cob. You look like hell. I need you to take her, Mrs. Lark's, Rowan said, his voice thick. He hated this. He was handing his child off, putting her in the line of fire. I know, Mrs. Larks said, her gaze moving to Nora, and then to the sleeping child. I heard the talk. Yorick, the railroad. She held out her arms, which were surprisingly strong. Give her to me. No one messes with my livery, not even the railroad. Nora, her throat tight, adjusted the blanket. She kissed Juniper's forehead, a quick, desperate press of her lips. She watched as Rowan placed his daughter in the other woman's arms. For a moment, she saw the terrible void, the space where the baby had been. Her eyes hardened with a renewed, cold purpose. This is why, she thought. They met Cutter at the edge of town as the sun went down. We ride, Cutter said. We ride all night. They arrived in Dust Lantern just as the sun was painting the eastern sky a sickly, pale yellow. It was Saturday. The bank opened in 2 hours. The town was quiet, but it was a tense, coiled silence. Men who were usually asleep were standing on boardwalks, smoking, watching. Yorick's men. Cutter dismounted at the far end of the street. You two, he said. Stay on the boardwalk. Be witnesses. But stay out of the street. This is my business. The clock on the telegraph office ticked over to 9 o'clock. The bank president, a small, nervous man named Harris, unlocked the heavy oak doors. At the same instant, a buckboard, which had been parked in front of the saloon, burst into motion. It was not heading out of town. It was bolting, full speed, for the bank. Clive Yorick was holding the reins, and E.M. Drake, the accountant, was clinging to the seat beside him. "They are running," Nora said, her hand grabbing Rowan's arm. "No," Cutter said, his voice calm. He did not run. He began to walk, his pace deliberate, straight down the center of the street. "They are not running. They are trying to beat me to the stamp." Yorick's buckboard screeched to a halt in front of the bank, the horses rearing in a cloud of dust. Drake and Yorick jumped down, scrambling up the bank steps. "Mr. Harris," Yorick yelled. "The transfer! Stamp the deed! Now! We have an emergency!" The street became a scene of choreographed chaos. A second wagon pulled out, this one laden with barrels, trying to block Cutter's path. Curses were shouted. Men spilled from the saloon. Cutter never broke his stride. He moved around the wagon, his hand inside his duster, holding the injunction. Inside the bank, Harris, his hands trembling, had the deed laid out on the counter. He fumbled with his heavy brass paid stamp. Yorick and Drake were at the window. "Stamp it," Yorick ordered. Cutter appeared in the doorway. He was not breathing hard. He was a pillar of cold, federal authority. Drake saw him. His eyes went wide with panic. He grabbed the deed, yanking it off the counter. Cutter lunged. He was not grabbing for Drake. He was not reaching for his gun. He was lunging for the paper. In a single, fluid motion, Marshal Abel Cutter slapped the injunction, the paper bearing Judge Tolland's wax seal, onto the deed just as Drake was pulling it away. Thud. The sound of the judge's seal, heavy and embossed, hitting the parchment of the deed was definitive. It thundered in the sudden, absolute silence of the bank. It was louder than a revolver. Drake stood frozen, holding one end of the paper. Cutter's hand pinned the other, the injunction covering Yorick's signature. The bank president stood with the stamp in his hand, hovering uselessly in the air. It was over. The doors of the bank burst open again. Sheriff Bram Kell stumbled in, his face red, his badge askew. He had run from the saloon, and he was too late. He saw the tableau. He saw Cutter. He saw the sealed injunction. "Cutter!" he roared, his voice thick with rage and whiskey. "What is the meaning of this? You have no jurisdiction. This is a local land dispute." Kell made the mistake of his life. He shoved Marshal Cutter. Cutter moved with a speed that was terrifying. He did not shove back. He grabbed the arm Kell had used, twisted it behind the sheriff's back, and slammed Kell, face first, against the brick wall of the bank. Kell's hat flew off. A federal star, glinting in the morning light, was pressed inches from Kell's contorted face. "You," Cutter hissed, his voice no longer polite, "are interfering with a federal officer. Sheriff, that is a hanging offense. Judge Tolland is in a sour mood. Do you wish to test it today?" Kell, pinned by his own temper and a power he could not fight, went limp. He was defeated. Rowan and Nora, who had watched from the doorway, stepped back onto the boardwalk. A crowd had gathered. They had seen the race. They had seen the confrontation. They saw Kell pinned to the wall. And they saw Clive Yorick, his face a mask of thunder. Someone, a miner with a face full of dust, let out a whoop. "Well, I will be. Paper beat pistols." The crowd cheered. It was the theater of it. The small, quiet marshal and the two smoke-stained ranchers beating the railroad and the corrupt sheriff. Clive Yorick, his face pale, his lips a thin white line, deliberately straightened his suit. He looked past the cheering crowd. He looked directly at Rowan and Nora. His smile did not reach his eyes. It was a terrible, cold promise. "You have won the day, Pike, you and your associate." He nodded. But injunctions expire, rivers dry, and I am a patient man. Clive Yorick's promise hung in the dusty street, heavier and more toxic than the smoke from the burned-out barn. Injunctions expire, rivers dry. It was a vow of patient, relentless destruction. They met Marshal Cutter back at the livery, where Rowan and Nora collected their horses. Juniper was still safe, sleeping in a straw-filled crate in Mrs. Larks's office, the old woman sitting guard with a shotgun across her lap. "He is right," Cutter said, checking the cinch on his own saddle. His voice was low, his polite mask gone, replaced by the grim focus of a hunter. "That injunction holds him in town, but it is only paper. Yorick knows the limits of my authority, and he knows Kell. He will not honor this."
"So, what happens now?"
Rowan asked, his hand resting on his rifle in its scabbard. "Now," Cutter said, "we end it, outside town limits, where the law is what we make it." He looked at Nora. "I got word from the wire. Kell is gone. Bribed the deputy I left on him with a $5 gold piece. He is a desperate man, which means he is Yorick's man, body and soul."
"They will come for the ledger,"
Nora said. "They will come for you," Cutter corrected. "The ledger is just the proof. You are the witnesses. No witnesses, no crime." He looked at them, his gaze hard. "Yorick's mistake is that he is arrogant. He thinks he can clean this up with bullets. He will follow you. He has to." The plan was set not in words, but in shared, desperate understanding. This was not an escape. It was a baited trap. They left Juniper with Mrs. Larks, a tearless, ripping farewell that left a cold void in Nora's chest. They rode out of town heading north, not west toward Pike's Hollow. They rode as a part of three: Cutter, Rowan, and Nora. For the first 2 miles, they rode hard through the soft dirt, leaving a clear, frantic trail for anyone to follow. Then they reached the slick rock, the vast, wind-scoured plates of red stone that held no tracks. Cutter reined in. "Here, this is where we split. I will take the high flank, circle the buttes. I will be your shadow." Nora unslung a small leather pouch. From it, she took 2 small, polished steel signal mirrors. She handed one to Cutter. "From the riverboat days," she explained. "1 flash for position, 2 for danger, 3 for close in." Cutter nodded, a brief, grim smile. "I will be watching." He turned his horse and vanished into a cut in the rock, his movement as silent as a passing hawk. Rowan and Nora were alone. They dismounted. Rowan took Hob, the mule, and tied his own saddle loosely to the mule's back. Nora did the same with her saddle.
"They are following 3 horses,"
Rowan said, his voice low.
"Let them keep following."
He slapped the rump of his own horse, and then Nora's, sending them running free, back toward the hollow. Then, leading the mule, which now carried 2 empty, visible saddles, he and Nora began to walk, leading it into the deep, soft dust of the canyon trail. They were now, to anyone tracking them, 2 people on foot, tired, slow, and cornered. A perfect, easy target. Their real track, the one they had just left, was a hidden one. They walked for a mile, then tethered the mule in a thicket of scrub oak, a visible prize. From there, they climbed, leaving the dusty canyon floor, moving onto the high, hard, slick rock. They were backtracking, moving parallel to the trail, their boots leaving no trace. They made for Red Harlot Butte, a towering maze of wind-carved corridors, natural bridges, and blind alleys. It was a place you went to lose someone, or to be lost forever. They were in position by high noon. Nora took the high ground, a narrow ledge that overlooked the main canyon. Rowan stayed low. Near the decoy trail, they waited. An hour later, they came. Yorick was in the lead, his clean broadcloth suit now stained with dust and sweat. Beside him was Bram Kell, his face a mask of raw fury, a new hat on his head, and behind them, looking pale and terrified, was the accountant, E.M. Drake, holding a rifle he clearly did not know how to use. They were tracking the mule, their movements fast and sloppy. "They are on foot," Kell growled, his voice echoing in the canyon. "They cannot have gotten far." They found the mule. Yorick saw the empty saddles. "They are running. Drake, stay with me. Kell, take the high trail. See if you can cut them off." Nora, watching from above, flashed her mirror once. Position. Far to the east, on a distant ridge, she saw a single answering flash. Cutter was in place. The trap was set. Rowan, hidden in the rocks below, waited. He let Yorick and Drake pass him, deeper into the canyon. Then he stepped out, moving silently to the trail behind them. He grabbed a heavy fallen juniper log and dragged it across the narrow path. The roadblock was in place. Yorick and Drake were penned in. Up above, Nora moved. She deliberately scuffed her boot in a patch of gravel, the sound loud in the stillness. "There," Kell roared, spotting the movement. "It is the woman." He spurred his horse, scrambling up the narrow side slit after her, his rage making him reckless. "Kell, wait!" Yorick shouted, but the sheriff was gone, blinded by his need for revenge. Nora ran, not with panic, but with a cold, calculated purpose. She knew this ground. She led him down a twisting, descending corridor of rock. She heard his horse slipping and cursing behind her. She reached the end of the slit. It opened onto a ledge. Below it, the floor dropped 12 feet to a collecting pool, a deep, cistern-like basin of stagnant, icy water. Nora stopped at the edge, breathing hard. Kell burst around the corner, his horse stumbling. He saw her, trapped at the ledge, and his face contorted in a mask of triumph. He leaped from the saddle, his pistol in his hand. "Now, you witch!" he snarled, lunging for her. Nora did not move. She simply sidestepped. Kell, driven by his own momentum, his boots slick on the worn stone, could not stop. He flailed, his arms windmilling, and plunged over the edge. He hit the water with a heavy, shocking splash. It was deeper than he thought. He came up, sputtering, waist-deep in the foul, cold pool, the shock of the icy water stealing his breath. He looked up. Nora stood on the ledge, looking down at him, with a roar of pure, animalistic fury. Kell tried to raise his pistol, but his hands were numb, his clothes waterlogged. He tried to scramble up the slick rock wall, his fingers finding no purchase. He slipped, falling hard against the stone, the impact jarring the pistol from his frozen grasp. The gun skittered across the wet rock, landing near the pool's edge. Kell lunged for it, crawling, splashing. A boot slammed down on the pistol, pinning it to the rock. Nora's boot. Kell froze, his hand inches from the weapon. He slowly looked up, his eyes following the line of her leg, to her cold, unyielding face. And then a shadow fell across the water, blocking the sun. Marshal Abel Cutter stood on the ledge beside Nora, his duster immaculate, his own revolver held loosely at his side. He looked down at the shivering, defeated sheriff. "Your badge looks heavy when it is rusting." "Bram," Cutter said, his voice flat. Down in the main canyon, Rowan heard the distant splash and the shout, but did not turn. He heard new sounds. Yorick and Drake returning, their way blocked by the juniper log. "What is this?" Yorick shouted, seeing the roadblock. "It is over, Yorick," Rowan said, stepping out onto the trail 20 yards behind them. He held his Spencer rifle, but it was aimed at the ground. Yorick spun, his rifle coming up. Drake yelped, stumbling back. "You!" Yorick breathed, his face pale, his eyes narrowing. He aimed his rifle, its barrel centering on Rowan's chest. You should have stayed on your burned-out ranch." Beside him, Drake was trembling, his own rifle shaking so badly it was useless. "Mr. Yorick," he stammered.
"The marshal, the injunction, this is not—"
"Shut up, Drake," Yorick snarled. "He is one man." Rowan looked past Yorick. He looked at the accountant. He saw a weak man, a terrified man, a man in so far over his head he was drowning. Rowan made his choice. He deliberately lowered his Spencer, resting the butt on the ground. It was an act of profound, suicidal trust.
"You keep your books or your soul, Drake,"
Rowan said, his voice quiet, but it echoed in the narrow space.
"Pick."
Drake stared at him. He looked at Rowan, unarmed. He looked at Yorick, whose rifle was aimed to kill. He looked at the hard red rock, which felt like a tomb. He thought of the fire, of Deacon Orte's body, of the cheering crowd, of his own name, E.M. Drake, signed on a fraudulent ledger. He broke. The terror, the guilt, the pressure of it all burst from him in a single, high-pitched wail. "The deed!" he screamed. His eyes screwed shut. "It is in the saddle, the real one. He has it in the cantle of his saddle. He was going to switch them." Yorick, betrayed, his face contorting in a mask of pure hate, did not hesitate. He spun, swinging his rifle not toward Rowan, but toward the man who had just condemned him. "You fool!" he shrieked. A sudden, violent gust of wind howled down the canyon, a physical blow that blasted them with sand and grit. It blinded them. Yorick, disoriented by the wind and Drake's betrayal, fired blind. He fired at the sound of Drake's voice. The bullet sparked on the rock, whining, going wild, a foot from Drake's head. In that same instant, Rowan raised his rifle. He did not aim for Yorick's heart. He aimed for the weapon. His shot was true. The bullet split the dark walnut stock of Yorick's rifle, shattering it. The force of the impact sending the gun flying from Yorick's hands and sending the wild shot harmlessly into the sandstone wall. Yorick stood, disarmed, his hands numb, his eyes wide with shock. A sound, like a whip crack, snapped through the air. Marshal Cutter's rope, it uncoiled, a perfect, whistling loop, and settled over Yorick's head and shoulders. Cutter, standing on the high ledge with Nora, did not wait. He hauled back. Yorick was jerked off his feet, not over the edge, but off balance, dragged scraping against the rock wall. He was caught. He was cuffed. He was defeated. He opened his mouth, and what came out was not a plea or a threat, but a string of curses in a language made of money, of stocks, of dividends, of percentages. The canyon, which had held the echo of gunshots and shouts, went silent. The wind died down. Far above, Nora stood next to Cutter, her hand on the cold steel of the signal mirror in her pocket. Below, Rowan Pike stood over the weeping, broken accountant, his rifle smoking in his hands. The canyon exhaled. So did they, with the injunction upheld by Judge Tolland, and the true, fraudulent deed pulled from Clive Yorick's saddle cantle. The syndicate collapsed like a house of rotted cards. E.M. Drake, the accountant who had been drowning in his own fear, became the state's star witness. He traded his soul back, saving his neck by meticulously detailing every stolen dollar, every false entry, and every act of intimidation Yorick had ordered. The trial was swift. Yorick, disarmed of his wealth and his influence, was a diminished, snarling figure, cursing in a language of lost dividends that the court did not understand. He was found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and, with Drake's testimony, solicitation of arson and murder. The railroad, it was determined, would have to find another, cleaner route. Sheriff Bram Kell, disgraced and facing federal charges for interfering with Marshal Cutter, did not wait for his own trial. He resigned under a black cloud of infamy, his tin badge left tarnished on an empty desk. He was last seen riding west, his new hat pulled low, a man without a county, without power, and without a future. Judge Tolland, in a ruling that was talked about for decades, voided every land claim the syndicate had made. He remanded the water rights of the Sable Fork and Pikes Hollow not to the railroad, not to the territory, but back to the small holders and ranchers who lived by them. And in a small, final addendum to the court records, the case against Nora Vale regarding the fire at Hallelujah Draw was dismissed. She was publicly cleared of the arson and of the murder smear that had been Kell's invention. The record showed, thanks to Marshall Cutter's report, that she was the one who had saved the children and the ledger, the very one that had brought the truth to light. Restoration was a slow, hard business, built hand by hand. The first thing they rebuilt was the church at Hallelujah Draw. The neighbors, the same ones whose water rights had been saved, came with wagons of fresh pine and whitewash. Rowan and Nora worked alongside them, Rowan's hammer driving nails, Nora's hand, now steady, painting the new walls. The bell, the one Nora had cut down to keep the sparks from spreading, was pulled from the ashes, its iron scarred but unbroken. They rehung it in a new, stronger tower. When it was done, the children, the ones Nora had led from the vestry, were the first to tug its rope. The sound that rang out over the valley was not the single, ominous toll of midnight, nor the clang of a fire alarm. It was clear, bright, and joyous, a sound of laughter and resurrection, with no trauma left in it. The second thing they rebuilt was at Pikes Hollow. One morning, a line of wagons appeared on the ridge. Rowan, instinctively reaching for his rifle, stopped. He recognized the man in the lead wagon. It was Milo Gant, the cowhand who had lowered his rifle in the face of Kell's order. He and a dozen other ranchers, small holders who had gotten their water rights back, had come to repay their debt. They did not rebuild the burned-out barn. They raised something better, a new windmill tower, tall and true, its blades angled to catch the slightest breeze from the mesa. It was a barn raising without a barn, a promise of a future. They worked all day, a community bound by shared sweat and a shared victory. When the last bolt was tightened, Nora and Rowan stood at the pump. The wind, which had been their enemy, bit the new blades. The tower groaned, the mechanism turned, and the pump handle coughed once, twice, and then gushed a steady, clean stream of cold water. A cheer rolled up from the men, a sound as deep and satisfying as thunder. They had their water. It was theirs. That evening, under the new awning of the cabin porch, which the men had repaired, Nora and Rowan exchanged their vows. There was no preacher. Judge Tolland had signed the papers in town, his sour expression briefly softening as he stamped it. It was a ceremony of simple words, witnessed by the setting sun and the quiet gratitude of their neighbors. Rowan's hand, calloused and clean, held hers, the cracks and rope burns on her own skin, a map of the journey they had taken. Juniper, held on Milo Gant's hip, watched the proceedings with wide, serious eyes, her small hand clutching a piece of celebratory blue ribbon, which she diligently gnawed. Rowan, his voice rough and low, spoke his promise. Nora, her voice clear and steady, spoke hers. When the words were done, he turned to her. The kiss was unhurried. They were not in the dark, hiding from gunfire. They were in the warm, golden light of their own home, surrounded by friends. They had time. Nora's fingers, which had once tested the seam of his shirt for permission, splayed at his jaw, holding him, her touch acclaiming. His other hand, the one that had once hovered uncertainly, settled on the small of her back, a gesture of absolute protection, of steadying, of home. The kiss was intimate, radiant, and as wholesome as the new-tilled earth. It was the seal on a promise that had been forged in fire and kept in faith. That night, long after the neighbors had gone, they stood on the porch. The scars on the cabin wall were dark shadows in the moonlight. The stars, thick as spilled salt, crowded the enormous dark. The new windmill was a silent sentinel, its blade still. A cricket, somewhere in the dark, began its song. Rowan, his chin resting on her temple, his arms wrapped around her from behind, began to sway. A slow, quiet dance, a tune only the crickets knew. Nora, leaning back against his solid strength, laid her palm flat against his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her hand. "The riverboat girl is gone," she whispered into the quiet. "The one who knew how to run, how to read the wires, how to hide, she is gone." She paused, her breath catching. "The ranch woman remains?" Rowan held her tighter. His voice was a low murmur against her hair. "I like them both." She turned in his arms to look at him, her expression questioning. "I like them both," he repeated, his gaze serious. "One taught you how to survive, how to be strong enough to make it here." He smiled, a small, genuine smile that had finally erased the lines of the widower. "The other," he said, "chose home." On the small table inside, visible through the open doorway, a fresh ledger lay open. The lamplight fell on its clean, new pages. The first few columns were neat. Practical calves, born May, seed, winter wheat, new pump washers. But on the far right of the page, Nora had made a new column. It was a heading that did not belong in any accounting book. It was labeled Mercies. There were no numbers in it yet, but it was a promise. A quiet, private fund for neighbors who might fall on lean months. A way to ensure no one else faced the same desperation they had. Far off, in the deep distance, a train whistle cut through the night. It was a lonely, mournful sound. The world, with its syndicates, its progress, and its dangers, was still coming. It would always be coming. But here, on the porch, Nora settled back against Rowan's chest, her hand covering his. Here, love held its ground, steadfast and unyielding, like the new windmill against a tireless sky. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below to share where you are in the world and what your thoughts were on Rowan and Nora's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us some extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.